Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for the first webinar of Cryptography, a short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. My name is Guy Coward and I'll be your MC for this webinar and for the duration of the course. Your mentor is the lovely and talented Matt Constable. Wherever you're watching this, we hope you're well. Before we begin, some housekeeping. All webinars for this course will be held at 7:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, with recordings made for those of you who cannot attend on a given occasion. Despite the recordings, if you can make it, we hope you'll attend the live webinars and contribute to a collaborative learning environment. Always get a little bit of a bonus in attending the live show, I think. We quite clearly use Zoom for our webinars and encourage questions and the use of chat throughout the course. We ask that you direct all questions relevant to course content to the Q&A section so that we can keep track of them, and that you send all administration type questions, dates, times, resource availability, and the like to the support team in chat. Support team being Hannah. You can chat with panelists only or to your fellow students as well, and you can make that choice by toggling through the drop-down box, as I've already said earlier, once you open the chat log. There are usually some really experienced attendees who are very good at sort of augmenting the discussion and maybe sometimes even going off on a tangent, also helping, I guess, those that are newer to the subject sort of catch up if you have what you feel is like maybe a really simple question that might sort of be beyond the scope of the course. Maybe just chuck it in the chat and say, hey, what's this mean? And then we can catch you up real quick there as a group together. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and if a question you have is particularly relevant, I'll just interject during Matt's presentation. For those of you who have never taken part in a short course with us, first of all, welcome and thank you for joining again. IT Masters is a training organisation that exists as a partner to CSU, an exclusive partner who we work with to create and deliver a number of their Masters courses. We also market these courses on their behalf and hope that the best way to do that is give some of it away free, which is part of what tonight is about. If we do a good enough job, then students will be encouraged to enrol in a full Masters or graduate certificate if it suits them and if it's the right time. With that said, I really hope this short course is useful and rewarding in its own right. We want you to learn some interesting information, have a bit of fun, hopefully make connections with some of your fellow students and indeed Matt. To date, nearly 5,000 people have enrolled in this short course, so there's plenty of people to talk with. It's very exciting. Well, it's always good to get a cybersecurity course going. It always gets a lot of good numbers, and I think it's also got a bit to do with Matt. Hannah is around tonight in the usual moderation role for IT Masters, looking after the chat, taming the cats, herding the cats. She's also responsible for the learn.itmasters.edu.au website, or the new Moodle page, or the course page. I use those terms interchangeably throughout the course, which is where you'll find the other materials needed, links to readings, discussion forums, quizzes, the exam when it comes up, and any sort of fun things that Matt has to get you to play with outside of there. He'll give you instructions on that page as well. If you have any questions tonight or later on about the goings on of the course, the details of the course, we've got some contact details there and you can hit us up there. Next week, I'll have a brief chat about CSU, just give you an idea of what studying with us is sort of about and how these short courses can help you in completing a postgrad course if that's your bag. So if you have any questions about that sort of stuff, maybe just hold them over and we'll get to them next week. And now I guess it's just time to welcome the wonderful Matt Constable, who's a stalwart of this short course program and always a joy to work with. He's got about 950 academic awards, many industry certifications in the IT space. He's an Iron Man. I'm pretty sure he cracked the Enigma code and has probably written about 15 books, but you know, who knows? Anything you can imagine, he's probably done it. Hello, Matt, how are you? What's your deal? What's going on?
Thank you, Guy, as ever, and welcome everyone. Hello to everyone. Hope everyone is safe and well. And thank you once again, Guy, for your wonderful introduction. I didn't quite crack the Enigma code. That was a little bit before my time. I'm not quite that ancient.
Oh, you're only 2 or 3 at the time. It's a prodigy.
Wow, geez. that still makes me pretty old. So
Sorry, mate.
yes, so I definitely didn't do that. But as you say, I have worn a number of hats over many, many years, and I like to think of myself as a jack of all trades without necessarily being a master of any of them. So, and you know, tonight's is the start of what I hope is going to be a really interesting and informative cryptographic short course for everyone. This evening, we're going to start off with a bit of a discussion on general cybersecurity, and then we'll filter into the cryptography. And as we go through the next 4 weeks, we will weave the two subjects together to hopefully give you a really good understanding of where cryptography fits within the cybersecurity landscape as one of the many, many tools and mechanisms available to enhance the security around your systems. This particular slide presentation this evening has been composed based on 2 of the subjects that we run. One is ITI 581 Cybersecurity Fundamentals, which is a subject that I've been running for best part of probably 10, 12, 13 years, something like that. And that's one of the subjects in the IT Master Stable. And the other one is ITC 593, which is a specific crypto course, which is taught by CSU themselves, but all part of the same stable of subjects, if you like. So, as I said, we articulate with these 2 particular subjects. So in this first evening, there's a bit of 50-50 between these 2 subjects, and then subsequently, we're really going to drill down more into the 593, the network security and crypto. And I guess really the aim is to try and give you some basic introduction to crypto. So we're not going to go into any really heavy duty maths behind that, although part of that will start to show itself over the next couple of topics, symmetric and asymmetric encryption. But we will look at the history of ciphers and some of the more common ciphers and introductory ciphers to give you an idea of what crypto or cipher algorithms actually do and the way in which they do it. And as we go on, we'll build on the complexity. So hopefully you'll get something really interesting out of that. I'll try to keep the maths down because it can be quite complex and it's not everyone's cup of tea. I'm first to say it's probably not my cup of tea either. But it's necessary to have a complete understanding of what goes on in the crypto world.
Hey, Matt, just before you go on, sorry, lovely picture, by the way. Just got a bit of feedback in the chat about a bit of crackly mic. I don't know if there's anything in particular you can do about it, but maybe just jiggle it or something. I don't know.
Maybe. Let's just see if this one.
It's not too bad, by the way. It's just a little bit. Yeah, as Bert says, it's workable totally.
Okay, has that made any difference?
Yes, it's more clear.
Okay, all right. We'll go that way.
Or some don't like it.
Some don't like it. Okay, all right. We might back to where I was. Okay, so I'll keep on this. So anyway, this is about me. So as Guy said, and I've been around the track quite a lot. I've spent a lot of time at university doing lots of different things, not just in the IT field. So my interests, I guess, are very broad, and that's why I say I'm a man of many talents, master of none. In order of importance, they are my loves in life. At the moment, I'm engaged in a rather significant research project around cricket. So that keeps me busy when I'm not working for the wonderful people at IT Masters. And this picture I'm actually quite proud of. That was me crossing the finish line in my first Ironman triathlon a few years ago. Another passion of mine that I really enjoy getting out and doing. Some people say I'm crazy, but it is certainly a lot of fun. The other thing that I certainly want to make known is that I will not have all the answers potentially to the questions that you ask. So what I can guarantee though is if there's something that stumps me, I will give my best effort in providing you with an answer that's appropriate and sufficient. But certainly there'll be people out there that will know equally as much about cybersecurity and crypto as what I do and are coming along for interest. So please make sure that you engage with each other via the discussion forums on Moodle and share that wealth of expertise. We've got 920 people here in this presentation now. There's bound to be a lot of expertise out there that you can learn from. So it's not just about coming and listening to me talk on a topic and asking me questions, but also about building those networking opportunities amongst the cohort that's in this class as well. It's really, really important that you think about that, because you'll get a lot more from that than you'll probably otherwise think. So certainly look at that. All right, so the outline for this evening, we're going to have a quick look at the introduction to cybersecurity concepts. So for about the first 18 or so slides, we're going to look at some basic definitions. We're going to look at a thing called the CIA Triad and talk about how that's important in cybersecurity. We'll look at some attack vectors, so different typical ways of attacking, and we'll look at the principle of defense in depth and a little bit around security perimeters. Then we'll look at the fundamentals and one way to categorize the primitive elements of cryptography. Okay, and that will allow us to then build upon those primitives as we move forward in subsequent weeks. So let's get started, I guess. So cybersecurity fundamentals, a definition. Information security is really simply a bunch of tools or mechanisms by which our networked information assets are kept secure, okay, with the primary goals of protecting the confidentiality of that information, so that is keeping secret, to maintain the integrity of that information, so that is we don't want unauthorized changes to our information. If it's an authorized change, that's fine, but if it's unauthorized, we don't want that to occur, and that ensures that the integrity of our information is maintained. And the last one is assure availability. The caveat with that is to assure availability to those who are authorized. Okay, so that's what it's really about. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability provided to authorized people, systems, entities. So leading on from that, our confidentiality, our integrity, and availability form what is called the CIA Triad. If you look at this graphic on the left here, we've got our information security systems in the middle here, and we've got our confidentiality, integrity, and availability that make up the three sides of the triangle. These are the important things of cybersecurity that we need to uphold and maintain. Now some of you may notice that this is quite a simple model, and there are other models, one of which I'll look on briefly on the next slide. There are other ways, other models that you can think about security components, but we use this one in ITI 581 because as a cybersecurity fundamental course, it's important to keep things really, really simple, and then you can build on that later on. So we'd like to start with this nice, simple model where we look at only three components. Now, on the flip side of that, if we have hackers or attackers or criminals or other nasties in this triangle over here, there are three alternate sides of this triangle, which are disclosure, alteration, and denial. Now, interestingly, and from the text up here, you'll clearly see that confidentiality is the opposite of disclosure. Integrity is the opposite of alteration, that is unauthorized alteration. And availability is going to be the opposite of denial. So these are what we call the CIA DAD triads. Now, when you implement your security mechanisms, it is possible to have confidentiality and integrity, but be in a state of denial. So you've got a denial of service attack, for example. So while the confidentiality and integrity of your information is still maintained, it may be that it is not available to authorized users. So it is possible to have one or two or even three of these from the DAD triad at the same time, or you may only have, you can mix and match. They can be mixed and matched. So you can also have a system that's available and it's confidential still, but for something has changed the integrity of your files. And so that's a state of alteration. And so it can mix and match quite easily, and quite often does. The McCumber Cube is a more complex model. So it's got, I'm not going to go into this one in any depth, merely because, as I said, it's good to keep the models nice and simple to start to build our understanding moving forward. And really, in terms of cryptography, the main things that we want to worry about are confidentiality and integrity, which we will look at in more detail when we come to that part in the slide deck. But this is an example, the McCumber Cube is an example of a more complex model, and there are many others as well that you may choose to use depending on your particular context. So CIA DAD Triad is quite a simple model, which has been around quite some time, and some people in some contexts prefer to use something more complex. But for our purposes, it does the job perfectly. So what should security provide? What should it actually give us? It should, a good, secure, defense in depth system should ensure that any authorized users are able to perform only the tasks that they need to perform in order to fulfill their role in the organization, whatever that is. So no more, no less. Security should ensure that users obtain only the information they are authorized to have. Okay, so again, no more, no less. Security should also ensure that the users cannot cause damage to data, applications, or the operating environment. Now that's can be a bit of a tricky one, because if you've got full access rights to something, then there is the potential for you to break it. Okay, so that's a bit more of a tricky one and can sometimes involve policies and procedures as well outside that technical scope of tools that we can implement. And lastly, it should ensure that data exchanges are conducted in a secure and safe manner. And this is in particular where our cryptography comes into equation. So this graphic here is quite a busy one. And I guess all I want you to get out of it is that there are lots of different ways in which your information security system or your information systems can be attacked, or compromised, or damaged, or otherwise made to not work well. So there's lots of words in here. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. It doesn't necessarily indicate they're more important than the others. It's just a graphic to show there's lots of things happening, lots of things that can potentially happen. There are certain important ones. Obviously, viruses and Trojans are common. We see lots of them all the time, and particularly in this period that we're going through where COVID is making or requiring or has required a lot of people to work from home, and the reliance on internet connections and online systems has gone through the roof. Then these sorts of things have started to creep into our daily lives more than ever. There are a number of ones here. There's terrorism. There's a very little word there, terrorism, which is interesting to see. There's also crime. There's warfare. There's alteration. There's our hackers, of course. There's hacking. There's spam. There's, as I said, criminal elements. So there's lots of different ways in which our systems can be compromised, damaged, and then we don't get access to them. So it affects the confidentiality, the integrity, and availability of our systems. Something I want you to think about is, as we go through the slide decks, and indeed as you go through, just as a learning exercise, as you go through any sort of security system, or you're working on a new security tool, or you might be coming up with a new design for a secure network, think about those elements of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and make sure that you're covering off each one of those elements in whatever it is that you're doing. Now, the important part about that is what you'll find over time, if you don't already know it, is that not all tools and mechanisms for helping us enhance our security are going to cover all of those three bases. So cryptography, perfect example, can help us confidentiality, tick, and integrity, tick, availability, not so much. Okay, so you can't say one size fits all in security. It's definitely a many tools approach. So what causes those threats we just looked at. Okay, so this is, and there are many ways to categorize threats, many ways. You can categorize them by the ways they're deployed, potentially by the ways you protect against them, by the damage they cause, or by the particular systems they attack. Lots and lots of different ways. In our cybersecurity fundamentals course, we categorize them in this particular way. So we rank them or rate them as technology weaknesses, weaknesses of configuration, weaknesses in policy, or simple human error. So if we break down each one of those to a small degree right now, some examples of a technology weakness are, for example, looking at the TCP/IP protocol stack. Now, it was initially designed as an open protocol, and way back when it was first written and developed, it was developed for survival, not security. So it just had to work to connect hosts and networks together in that educational context, and then a little bit later on a military context. But it wasn't about security because there was hardly anyone that was using it to connect. The network was very small. And so there was no real worry about security because no one had access to it. But of course, as things exploded, the internet arrived, and it became this all-encompassing thing, which it is now, that's interwoven in every single aspect of our lives, then obviously that it provides us with a huge opportunity of gaining access to information or markets that we didn't have previously. But it also provides significant opportunity for criminals as well. And so security is an exceptionally important part of every IT system that we implement. We need to think about it really carefully. But because the TCP/IP protocol was open, built for survival, and there are thousands of, probably hundreds of thousands of applications and services that rely on it, any weaknesses that are with that old protocol stack now also can potentially impact the applications and services that run over the top of it. So that's a technology weakness. Operating systems are another one. There are millions and millions of lines of code in contemporary operating systems. They're big, bloated behemoths. And of course, trying to get these operating systems to market really quickly in development, sometimes bugs are introduced, which then lead to vulnerabilities, then lead to exploits, which then lead to breaches of our confidentiality, integrity, or availability. Now, it's a double-edged sword, operating system development, or indeed any software development, because there's a very fine line you have to tread in getting that product to market so it can be used, but making sure that it's also sufficiently secure. And anytime you make a change to things, there is a potential to introduce bugs, which leads to vulnerabilities, exploits, and problems with your CRNA. Network equipment also as well. If we just think of switches and routers as pieces of tin, then it could be, for example, that because of budget constraints or because of a poorly designed network, it may be that you implement or purchase switches and routers that are insufficient for what you really need in terms of capacity, so how much throughput they have, or perhaps in the features that you require. And this can be difficult to upgrade. Yes, you can upgrade the software potentially at a cost, but is that really going to do the job? Particularly if you're talking about, you bought a router with 100 meg interfaces when in fact you need 10 gig interfaces. Okay, very different platform that you have to upgrade to. So there's some examples of technology weaknesses. In terms of configuration weaknesses, these are all things that you will have seen probably many times before, a lot of you in your experiences. So things like poorly secured or unsecured accounts, particularly system accounts that run processes in the background that we often don't think about. System accounts, or indeed any accounts with really easily guessed passwords. So if you don't have a correct, robust and implemented password policy, then you can get yourself into a fair bit of trouble. Misconfiguration. of any type of, it says internet services there, but it can be of any type of service. Any type of service at all. Could be your DNS, your DHCP, your Active Directory, your web services, mail, FTP, you name it. If you've misconfigured it or haven't secured it properly, open to attack. Default settings are a common one, particularly in small organizations, not so much in larger organizations, because they generally tend to have more staff, more knowledgeable staff, a bigger picture approach to the design and implementation of security. But certainly in smaller organizations or organizations that don't have a great IT support base, default setting, devices can be just placed into a network of default settings, and that can cause real issues potentially. Misconfigured network equipment can also result from the same things that I've just been talking about with unsecured default settings. Now, Trojan horse programs and viruses are just a couple of examples of things that can leak into your network should you have configuration weaknesses as well. Now, there's no doubt they can get into your network in other ways as well, but certainly configuration weaknesses can let them in as well. And in that regard, we're talking, an example might be misconfiguration of some firewall rules or something, or some misconfiguration of intrusion detection systems that allows that to slip through the net, or to be delivered to, say, the email inbox of a user who then clicks something and deploys this thing everywhere because the security systems haven't been adequately configured. Policy weaknesses, again, pretty straightforward. So really the big pictures we're talking about here is just not having written security policies. So whether that's an acceptable use policy, whether it's a password policy, as it says there, non-existent disaster recovery plan. So not having a policy about what you're going to do in the event of a disaster and how you're going to keep your network and systems up and operational. That's a really big one. Staff politics or interdepartmental politics can manifest itself as policy weaknesses as well, with people arguing over who does what. There can be grey zones, there can be areas of responsibility that are left out because no one wants them, or there's arguments about it. So politics can do that. High turnover in staff can also lead to issues with particularly policy deployment or policy enforcement. As you turn over staff, you need to retrain them to make it, as new staff come in, they need to be trained and understand how things operate. That can be a bit of a long finger process, and so that can lead to issues with that as well. Not applying concise access controls. So not implementing policy is also a potential policy weakness, because on top of saying this is our access control policy, there needs to be a defined methodology for implementing it and understanding how to test it to ensure that it actually works. So that can also be an example of a policy weakness. And things like, so this one here is really software and hardware installation changes do not follow policy. So that's really talking about a change management policy and how that fits together within your organization. And last but certainly not least is human error. And we can't avoid this and we can't ignore it because it will happen. It will always happen. People make mistakes, simple as that. And systems make mistakes because of the input from us as humans, configuring them, designing them, putting them into place. Okay, so a lot of this boils down to human error. Of course, we can have accidents. Of course, we can have ignorance. Okay, and that's not to say people are stupid. That's just to say they're unaware or they don't know about a certain process or policy or implementation or something going on that they probably should. Workload can be an issue as well if you're overworked, which in the IT industry, let's face it, who isn't most of the time, that really impact your effectiveness and therefore can impact on security if you are in a role that is really heavily involved with security. Of course, we're always going to have the dishonest cohort, so people who don't do the right thing. You're not going to get away from that. Our social engineering is a big one, and we talk quite a lot about that in ITI 581. It's quite an interesting, I think it's a really interesting topic and a really useful one because, and I haven't got the stats here with me, but in 581, we talk about how often attacks or breaches of confidentiality, integrity, or availability are actually caused by internal actors. So not people out on the internet, which is what everyone thinks about, the layman thinks about. But there's lots of things that happen inside your network because the level of trust and the level of access of the people inside your network is typically much higher than those that exist outside your network. And so that opportunity for things to go wrong is even more heightened. And then disgruntled employers probably feeds a little bit into that dishonesty bracket as well. So employers get upset with something, either perceived or real, and then may take some sort of nefarious action on your organisation. Now, defence in depth is a really important component of this, of cybersecurity, and really, although would not normally reference Wikipedia, it's certainly good for, not so good for academic writing, but really good for general knowledge. Defence in depth, as defined on Wikipedia, says that it's an information assurance concept in which multiple layers of security controls are placed throughout an information technology system for the purpose of protecting the information that's held within that information technology system. So it talks about multiple layers. Multiple layers are harder to defeat. Okay, so the more levels of security you have to get through in order to get to the internal information, the more difficult it is. We know that most attackers, unless they're very, unless they just want to take your network down and do a denial of service, for example, will try to take the path of least resistance. Okay, so if they want to get into your information and get, say, trade secrets or intellectual property, then they need to do it in such a way that's not going to trip any alarm bells. So you don't know they're there. And the more layers you put in place, the more likely it is, or the harder the challenge is for them to get deep into your network, to get that intellectual property, the greater the chance that you will notice something before they get in. That's not to say you will defeat every hacker, you certainly won't. But the more layers you've got, the better protected you are. As it says there, there is no such thing as perfect security, only really good security. In a successful defense in-depth application, we have to understand what the vulnerabilities are inherent in our systems. Okay, so we have to know what the problems are before we can fix them. On top of that, we also have to understand how those vulnerabilities can be attacked or will be potentially attacked. With those two pieces of information, we can then move forward and come up with some ideas of how we're actually going to protect against that. But we must know those two things first. And this graphic here, I think highlights quite a few things. And I'm sorry if it's a little bit, but I don't know, it's just my eyes or whether it is a little bit blurry. But this is a perfect example of a setup which has lots of different layers. So on the inside here, we have our mission critical assets, and then around it, we have all these different layers. Okay, we've got our prevention, our policy management, monitoring and response operations. We've got our data security, our application security, then some endpoint security, then network security, and then finally perimeter security. Now, some of these tools on this diagram will exist at multiple levels, and that's okay, they will. But you can set, if we go from the outside in, the more layers we have, the longer it's going to take us as a hacker to get into that mission critical asset and that information that we want. It also recognizes quite nicely that there are also inside threats. So people on the inside that exist inside this perimeter, which incidentally is a very fluid concept now. And this diagram recognizes that. So that's one less, potentially two less layers these internal threats actually have to penetrate before they get to the information they want, or alternatively, the information that's going to be damaged in some way so that our confidentiality, integrity, or availability are threatened. Of course, now with the advent of public and private cloud technologies, there are, even though that's a separate abstracted layer, there's a bigger opportunity for attackers that can somehow gain access to that private or public cloud to then infiltrate onto the inside of our network. Because often, more often than not, well, certainly with public cloud, but more often than not with private cloud as well, we don't manage those particular environments. And so we don't see necessarily what's outside those environments trying to come in. Particularly with the private cloud though, if someone comes in there and gets inside your private cloud and you don't manage it, someone else is responsible for that, the provider, and they get inside that private cloud, it can be a really quick way into the inside of your network. So I think this is a relatively good diagram that takes into account a number of different layers and lots of different aspects of what defense in depth really should look like. All right, so that's it for cybersecurity fundamentals. Do you want to pause? Is there any particular questions that have
Yeah, there's a few goodies. We'll get through them. Rightio, we'll take it from the top. Tony is asking, no rush on answering this question, but what computer language is the cryptography course using if I was to enroll in your subject?
The crypto course doesn't actually use any language specifically, so it's more around, so there's online tools and packages which you can use in ITC 593, which is the network security and crypto subject. But there's not a lot of programming in terms of actual coding yourself. So it's more looking at the ciphers and the mathematics behind the cryptography algorithms. But in general, in some of the other subjects where there is a little bit of coding, it's mainly using Python. So if you're familiar with Python, or if you want to get familiar with Python, that would be the one I would point you to.
Thanks for that. And Tony, I've just sent you a link to the subject on CSU's handbook online, so you can have a look at the subject itself as well. Ray's wondering about whether information security should also cover information at rest, not just networked information assets.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. It should cover all aspects of your information. So that graphic is just showing network information assets, but it equally applies to the concept of defense in depth, and a lot of those mechanisms on that applies equally to information at rest. Absolutely.
Thank you, Ray. There's quite a few good questions. I'll just go through about 5 or so,
Okay.
and then we'll keep going. Andy's wondering, what would you call a compromised firewall? Man-in-the-middle attack, or packet sniffing, or something else? Apologies if this sounds naive. No apologies necessary, Andy.
No, it certainly doesn't sound naive. It's a good question. Compromised firewalls can involve all sorts of things. So it could be something like a man-in-the-middle attack, maybe, although a lot of firewall systems are pretty good at detecting those sorts of things. Generally, an attack, in a lot of cases, attacks on firewalls themselves is more around trying to take the firewall out. Denial of service or trying to gain administrative access to the firewall itself. And a lot of firewalls are really good. And indeed, it's one of the things we talk about in 581, Cybersecurity Fundamentals, is the abilities that firewalls need to have to be able to detect and log attacks to themselves. So look, in terms of compromising the firewall itself, it would more, I would think, in my experience anyway, it's centered more around denial of service and trying to get administrative access. In terms of going through the firewall, definitely. So there's lots of different tunneling type attacks that you can use to bypass a firewall and get through even a really good strict set of rules. You can certainly use encryption and cryptography technologies in order to bypass, or you like, or go through a firewall without being noticed. And that would generally be, as I said, in my experience, that's what I have found more, is that people will try to go through the firewall, try to bypass the rule base using either some sort of tunneling type protocol, or trying to, for example, use telnet SSH, for example, over a different sort of protocol. So trying to pretend it's, say, web traffic or FTP traffic or something like that. But certainly, even something like a firewall that has been physically damaged or blown a power supply, that's a compromised firewall as well. So there's lots of different aspects of that in terms of the actual firewall itself. But in general, attack vectors will tend to try and bypass a firewall rather than to actually attack it itself.
We've got a nice funny in the chat from Richard Harris. What would you call a compromised firewall? Answer, McAfee. And just Andy, on that apology, no apologies from anyone, please, for sounding naive. If you have a question, no matter how naive you think it might sound, chuck it in. Afun asks, can technological weaknesses be found in both IT and OT systems? That's info technology and operational technology systems. And can they be different? Can the same rules, tools, techniques, and hardware be used to ensure the security of both systems?
So yes, on both cases. Yeah, so absolutely. Technology weaknesses can be found in any system, any type of system. So that's exactly the same. And you can fundamentally use the same theories, ideas, tools, techniques, and mechanisms to be able to protect both systems. So yes to both is a simple answer.
Beauty, thank you. And I think that also answers Andrew's question, who is wondering about if all the weaknesses are fixed or improved in a system, does it mean the system's bulletproof, or is it still vulnerable due to evolving technologies?
Yes, no such thing as bulletproof. Because I guess the answer to that is, well, you may have one particular system that is exceptionally difficult to compromise. There's, rarely do you have any useful information system or network system that has, one component or one tool. So while you might have really good, say you might have a firewall that's rock solid and never gets defeated in your environment, because we've got to contextualize it to the individual environment we're talking about, because each industry, each enterprise, each environment will have different weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and therefore different attack exploits against it. But yeah, even if you have one technology which is rock solid, chances are you're going to have another one which will have weaknesses somewhere that will make that rock solid device less secure.
Thank you. And last one for now. Craig, in your opinion, is it better to have more complicated passwords, or to have the users change their passwords on a 90-day or any sort of basis?
In my opinion, I'd have both, but the answer to that is it depends. It depends on what your users can handle and can tolerate. So, for example, I've worked in some places where we would have 20 character passwords that had to have, basically alphanumeric and then other special characters in them as well. And they had to, we had to rotate them every 90 days. And then there was, you couldn't go back and use the same one for 12 password changes and all those sorts of things. Yet I've worked in other organizations where if you had more than 8 passwords that only had alpha characters, users would be, really annoyed and upset at it. So I guess it comes down to two things. One is, what can your users tolerate? And two, what operationally does your organization require? So how secure do you really need to be? Obviously, the more complex the passwords are, the more often you get them to change, and the less often you allow them to reuse passwords, the more secure you're going to be. But it's really a question for your environment and what it can tolerate.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Let's keep going. And thanks everyone for sending those questions in.
Yep, all excellent questions. All right, so now let's get to the party, the crypto fundamentals. So cryptography is the science or study of the techniques of secret writing, especially code and cipher systems, methods, and the like. So what it's really about is scrambling plain text to turn it into ciphertext. So making our information secret, keeping it confidential from those who shouldn't be looking at it. There are other cryptographic techniques which we're at in week 4 primarily. So we'll look at hashing in week 4. They also provide us with integrity of data, but the real key with crypto is secrecy, the confidentiality. crypto really is essential in contemporary communications, but often not used so much outside of military education, and I'm talking about tertiary and higher education in some aspects, and particularly around research or other big businesses. Now, sure, when we use our web browsers, we go to our internet banking page, that's encrypted. Okay, the HTTPS in our title bar, in our destination bar, shows us that that's encrypted. So there are a number of applications and sites, websites and web-enabled services that we use every day that do have HTTPS, so they're encrypted. But when you talk about how we communicate via business, typically we do it via email. Inside of email, there is the ability inside the email protocols that people use, so whether it's IMAP or POP or whatever, there is the capacity to implement encryption, but it's not used as often as what it probably should be. So we need to start thinking about crypto and how we make it intrinsic to systems, because in order to be at its best, encryption should be part of a communication systems, not an add-on. So it should be an intrinsic part of it that was written right from day one, better if it can be. Now, of course, crypto is generally thought of as being a good thing. So, things like securing nuclear launch codes or protecting our financial, medical, or other personal details. But as I said before, because of the ubiquity of the internet and things like the Internet of Things and the Internet of Everything, which is, definitely, if it's not here already, it's coming. It opens up so many, as I said, as individuals, it opens up so many more opportunities for information, for markets in business, for collaboration, okay, that we didn't have 20, 30, 35 years ago. Or not as much, and certainly before the advent of the internet, it was really able to do that. It was a slow process. But of course, because everyone's now connected, the criminal element in our society is also connected, and they can use it. They can use encryption for keeping their secret as well, which from a law enforcement perspective, or a good versus evil type battle, then that's obviously a bad thing. So, as I said, the crypto goals, number one is confidentiality, and that is protecting information from casual prying eyes or deliberate attempts to steal. And we'll talk about a thing called computational infeasibility shortly, and that is really central to this argument about confidentiality. We need to remember that the information we're protecting with our crypto or encryption doesn't always have to be of a real significant value to anyone other than us. So it may be that it's just really important to us. It may not be important to the world at large, but if it's important to us and it becomes compromised or someone else steals it and uses it either against us or for their own benefit, then that's a problem. And of course, confidentiality is the common layman definition of what security is really about. So if you spoke to the average Joe on the street and said, okay, what's encryption used for? Or this is explain a little bit of what encryption is, it's scrambling things up, what do you think it's used for? They would probably say, well, it's for keeping secrets. It's for keeping things confidential. And of course, crypto and encryption ciphers directly address that by taking a plain text and turning into something that's scrambled and can't be unscrambled by anyone other than the intended recipient. Okay, that's in theory. Now we know in practice that is not necessarily the case, but again, that's where this concept of computational infeasibility comes into it, and we'll talk about that shortly. Another thing that crypto can provide is integrity. So there are some components of crypto that will perform verification and validation of data post-transit. And we'll look at some of those in subsequent weeks. Fundamentally, integrity is about digitally signing data so that any changes to the signature in transit will identify the fact that the underlying data has had its integrity compromised while it's been in transit. Okay, and that could be for any reason. It's not necessarily that there's been a man-in-the-middle attack, for example. It may just be that the transmission has failed for some reason, or something's become corrupted along the way. So it doesn't necessarily tell us we're being attacked, but it tells us that something's not quite right with the data and we need to investigate. Now, the interesting thing about integrity attacks is that they can actually be really, really dangerous, and they can be sometimes really difficult to confirm, because a deliberate integrity attack are typically designed to result in an unexpected but seemingly legitimate result. So say, for example, a really simple example is we talk about a financial transaction, okay? And it may be that the financial transaction is, please deposit $1,000 into Fred's account. Someone will intercept that transmission and they'll say, you know, please deposit $1,000 into Bill's account. Okay, so that might go to the bank, and the bank goes, okay, well, I was, you know, well, thinking, well, this probably should go to Fred, but it's Bill, and okay, it all looks okay. Right, we'll send it through. So it's one example, or it could be that the value is changed. So instead of saying $1,000, it might say $1,100 as a really simple example. So it's not a totally stupid request. It still looks like it could be, it's plausible, but it's slightly unexpected. And so because of that, particularly if in the example of financial transactions, if they're altered by a little bit, for example, a small amount, or for example, the account they're being sent to is only one digit different, then they can be really, they might go on for ages and people not know. And I'll give you an example of that would be, you know, financial transactions. I can think of a couple of examples from many years ago where tellers who were employed, and these are two different cases, but I'll use the term tellers, plural. Tellers would take interest transactions, and where an interest transaction was, so the interest was such that it would only deposit a cent or 2 cents. So typically in one case it was less than 3 cents, and the other case it was less than 5 cents. If it was less than that, instead of putting it into the account that had earned the interest, they siphoned it off and they were putting it into their own account. This is only 1, 2, 3 cents at a time. And so it was something, again, it was an unexpected result, but it wasn't, because it was so small, it just wasn't picked up. And these tellers were doing this for years and years and years and ended up siphoning off literally millions of dollars from clients because no one noticed that 3 cents interest was missed. Or if they did miss it, they'd bank error, we don't care because it's only 3 cents. But you add up all those 1, 2, 3 cents over all the many thousands of clients that the bank had over time, and bingo, there it goes. Now that's obviously not an example where encryption would necessarily help with that because that's an insider attack, but it's an example of how attacks on the integrity of your data can be minuscule and still result in really big outcomes. Availability. Okay, so we mentioned this because although it is a component and a major component of the CIO triangle, it's unfortunately not something that crypto can help with. And it's important to understand this because then we understand then that crypto and encryption systems are not the be all and end all, but they are part of a good defense in depth strategy. Authentication. So this is confirming that the person that you think sent you a transaction or information really did. And this is obviously really clearly important for commercial transactions. The flip side of that is non-repudiation as well. People can't deny they sent you something. And that is something, both of these are things that crypto systems or systems enabled with encryption technology, and we'll get into this a little bit more in week 3, can help with both of those, authentication and You can't prove something is secure, only that it's insecure. Okay, so you can run an algorithm a million times and never break it. You still can't say definitively that it's 100% secure, because it only takes one time where it fails to be insecure. There is a difference between encryption algorithms and the way in which they're implemented, and we'll see that as we go along. Proprietary algorithms are not trustworthy. So just because someone comes up with a whiz-bang algorithm and says, hey, this is great, I wrote it, doesn't mean it's trustworthy. It needs to be tested. It needs to be used for a while, let out in the wild before you really know whether it's trustworthy or not. The most important thing about any crypto system is the secrecy of the key. Doesn't matter how good an algorithm you use, if you don't keep the key secret, it's not going to work. As I said before, crypto should be intrinsic to a system, so ingrained within the system to be of best value. Remember that no matter how good your crypto is, it can be cracked given sufficient time and resources. And again, comes down to this principle of computational feasibility, which I promise we'll get to in a minute. And lastly, secure today does not mean secure forever. The pages of history are littered with encryption techniques or ciphers that are now no longer useful because we can easily break them. And we're actually going to look at some really good examples of that next week, starting from next week. So crypto primitives. I'm wary we're a little bit behind time, but I'm using the excuse of guy talk at the top, so I've got a few minutes left. So crypto primitives, this is one way of categorizing the basics of crypto, okay? And we're doing it this way because A, it articulates with our subject 581 cybersecurity fundamentals, but B, even more importantly, is it perfectly articulates with the topics of the next 3 or 4 weeks. So we've got generation of random numbers, we've got symmetric encryption, we've got asymmetric encryption, and we've got hashing, digital hashing. Now, each of these can be used on their own for different purposes, but in a crypto system, they're generally used together, each providing a little piece of the puzzle. So random numbers are literally random strings of bits, so ones and zeros, okay? Now, it is true that truly random numbers are not really possible using algorithms alone, because algorithms are written by people, they're predictable, just like we are. They're not truly 100% random, right? There may be some recent research that might debunk that, but in general, the random number generators we're talking about in these systems are not truly random. But they don't need to be. They only need to be pseudo-random, because they only need to be unpredictable, not totally random. And again, this ties into this computational and feasibility concept, which I keep teasing you with. Number 2 is symmetric encryption, also known as single key encryption, conventional encryption, traditional encryption, whatever you want to talk about. It uses a single key, generally shared. Well, of course it has to be, because if you don't share it with anyone, then you can't encrypt traffic to anyone. But that single key is used to both encrypt and decrypt. So if we quickly look at this example graphic here, we have a sender who's got some plain text that they want to send to the recipient. They pass it through an encryption cipher or algorithm, if you will. They also put the shared secret key through that same cipher with the plain text, and it pops out a ciphertext, a unintelligible piece of text that doesn't, just strings of digits that don't make any sense whatsoever. That then gets sent across the wire digitally. So we might send it by email, we might transmit it by FTP, we might send it across a local area network or a wide area network, we could send it across a wireless connection, doesn't matter. We could send it via sneaker net carrying a USB key, for example. The point is, once it gets to the recipient is not going to be able to read the ciphertext unless they decrypt it. So they pass it through the same algorithm using the same key, and they decrypt it to yield the initial plain text that the sender sent. And so in this section here, during transmission, the information is 100% protected within limits. At this end, it's plain text that the recipient can actually see. So that in a nutshell is symmetric encryption. We're going to expand on that in much greater detail next week. So this is really just a little taster. Suffice to say, it uses a single algorithm, single key. Now, here it is. Symmetric encryption uses the notion, because it's only got a single key, it uses the notion of being computationally secure. And what that means is that the time it would take for an attacker to brute force or compute all the possible key combinations is so large, and they would need so many resources that they're not going to be able to do that within the time frame that the encrypted information is useful to them. Okay, so what that means, it takes them longer to break it, and by the time they break it, the information that they've got is now no longer useful to them. It's worthless. So that is, it's just not worth the effort. So long as your encryption system is computationally secure, then you've got the best level of protection that you can really hope for, particularly with symmetric encryption. Now, the ability to use ciphers or encryption algorithms is a little bit hamstrung by the fact that because we only have a single key, and that key is not really protected and it needs to remain secret in order for encryption to be numero uno, then we have to share that key somehow between our communicating parties. The question that raises is, how do we keep this secure? How do we, particularly in an online environment, how do we transmit it so it is secure and doesn't get compromised? Because as soon as someone knows the key, even if they don't know the algorithm, not that many algorithms that they have to go through, and they'll be able to decrypt our information. This is something that we'll learn a lot more on in the coming weeks, but it's a question, just keep it in the back of your mind because the answer will reveal itself over the next couple of weeks. Asymmetric encryption is primitive number 3. This is also called public key encryption. And in this system, we actually have 2 keys. We have a private key and a public key that are generated as a pair. Now, the public key we publish on the internet, and we'll talk about how that's protected in subsequent weeks as well. But we publish the public key on the public internet. So anyone can download that, and then using that, they can encrypt information to send to you. Now, the only way you can decrypt that information is using the private key that was generated as part of the private public key pair. So assuming you keep the private key to yourself and its secrecy is maintained, then you're the only person that can decrypt that information that is sent to you that has been encrypted with the public key that you put out on the internet. Okay. Now, when you send information out, you would encrypt it with your private key, okay, which only you have. You send it to someone, and if they can decrypt it with a public key, they have 2 things. One is that they know, one is that they've got a secret communication that's confidentially being maintained. But the other thing is they know that it's come from you, and that's making the assumption that that private key is secure and you've created it. Okay, so there's a couple of questions there. How can we know for certain that a public key that we're using has actually been created by the person that's named in the public key? And how do we know that the private key hasn't been compromised? Okay, they're 2 important questions. Again, you need to think about. Questions will reveal, the answers will reveal themselves over the next couple of weeks. Now, the thing about asymmetric encryption is it is slower than metric encryption. It's a 2-key process, more complex algorithm. So yeah, sure, it's slower, but it's definitely more secure. The other thing it allows is it protects against breaches while sharing keys, because we don't share keys. We give someone a public key and we keep the private key separate and secret. Okay, so we're not actually sharing anything. Again, there's a question there. How can we confirm the identity of our public keys? So think about that, and we'll talk about that through. And last one is our hashing functions. Okay, so hashing algorithms, which we talk about in week 4, and these are quite nifty little things because they're a mathematical algorithm that takes a file or a message or whatever it is we want to send, and it doesn't matter how big it is. It can be infinitesimally small or it can be massive. Doesn't matter how big it is. You send that file through this hash with this wonderful mathematical algorithm, and it comes up with a smaller fixed size message called a digest or a hash. And it's just literally a string of hexadecimal characters. Now, how big that message is determined by the algorithm you're actually using. So if you're using, say, for example, a 56-bit hash function, then it will produce a 56-bit value. Now, the great thing about that value is that it is completely tied to the actual file and contents that you have hashed, if you like. The other thing is they're one way. So encryption, two ways, right? We can encrypt, and then at the other end, we have to decrypt. Okay, so we can see what's going on. Hashes don't work that way because their fundamental role is to prove integrity. So this is where our integrity comes in. Confidentiality, encryption, integrity through our hashing functions. They only need to be one way. And you will see this on vendor. So example, if you go to download something from Microsoft or Cisco or any other vendor, they will often, not always, but often provide you with a hash value. And what you do is you download the image that you want, you download the hash value, you run the image through the same hashing algorithm, and then you compare the output that you've got to the hash algorithm you downloaded off their website or got off their website. And if the hash values match, guess what? Your file's integrity has been maintained in the download. So you've got exactly what they put up. So you've had no problems in transmission, everything's great. So in that context, they're using it to confirm, or you're using it to confirm that what you think you downloaded, you actually have, and you've got the right file, okay? And in a crypto system, it's used to ensure or to prove that the integrity of the communication has been maintained as it's been transmitted. So computational infeasibility, can do this again. So the properties of a hash is that it's computationally infeasible to find two messages to hash to the same digest. So in other words, if a hacker was to find a hash value, it would be impossible, well, not impossible, but it would take so much time for them to write out a message that generated the same hash that by the time they did it, the information would be useless. And so that they wouldn't, it's no point in them doing it. It's not worth the effort. It just takes way too much time. So it doesn't matter whether they've got a hash, they can't reverse engineer it, so to speak. So as that point says, given a digest, it is computationally infeasible, basically impossible, to try to find the original message from that. And you can't even, as the first point says, type up a message. So if you've got a hash of a Word document, you want to know what's in the Word document, you could spend forever trying to type out one and then run it through a hash algorithm. No, it's different. Damn, we haven't found the right one. Go back and type some more, change the text. You've got no way of doing it. The only way it's possible is if you perhaps have some insight into what the contents of that document are. But still, it's very, very difficult to, virtually impossible. We'll see in the next couple of weeks when we start looking at ciphers, and this is an example of this is how they broke Enigma code, was that they actually had some insight into a couple of words in the Enigma code messages, and they were able to break it because of that. So anyone that's seen the movie on Alan Turing, already read the book about him, then you'll know the story. But we'll talk about that in subsequent weeks, and you'll be able to see, particularly next week, we'll do some examples of where having some insight into what the content of the message could be is really, really helpful in cryptanalysis. So if we have a quick look at a hash function here, this is a pretty simple example, although it's a pretty big example as well. So we've got the word fox going through a hash function will generate this hash. I don't know what this algorithm is, just an example. If we change the text to read, the red fox runs across the ice, and run it through the hash function. We generate this for you, so you can see it's totally different to this one. But if we change just one word, the red walks across the ice. So it's still got the basic idea or thrust of the message is the red fox is transiting across the ice using some mode of transport. When we hash it, it comes out with a completely different answer. Now, that's obviously quite a big change, changing a word, but you could effectively add a space in, or you could turn, say, the I into a capital I instead of a small I. The hash would still spit out a totally different hash value. If you were to just capitalize all the letters, so it doesn't change the message at all, you just capital letters instead of lower and uppercase, some will change. Okay, so it is completely unique to that individual piece of text. Now, I'm sure there's somewhere they may have even put a question or a comment about that. There is the possibility of hash clashes, and that is simply possible because algorithms that we use for hashing don't use infinite bit sizes. So say, for example, if you use a hash function that uses 4 bits, for example, the likelihood of a hash clash, so in other words, 2 pieces of text eliciting the same hash, quite high. If you use a 56-bit hash value or hash algorithm, obviously a lot less. If you use a 1024-bit hash algorithm, you're probably never going to, in your lifetime, going to run into a clash that's going to be significant. Of course, theoretically, there is a possibility of hashes, but functionally not going to happen. So because of these properties, hashes are very useful in the application of digital signatures and storing passwords in particular. But we'll look at that in much detail in week 4. Okay, so that we come to the end of the basic content. So this is our basic intro to cybersecurity, a little bit about on crypto and how they two mesh together. So for this week, there are some Module 1 activities available up on Moodle, and there's a Module 1 Quizlet. Okay, so basically this week we've got a pretty simple discussion on a forum discussion. There's a couple of questions you can look at there. There's also an article on a compromisation of some health information in WA. So have a read of that and start thinking about the sorts of value the encryption may have provided in that sort of particular case, if anything. And have a look at the discussion forum questions and have a go at answering those and generate some discussion, and then have a go at the Module 1 Quizlet. So it's pretty straightforward Quizlet, 5 questions, not all multiple choice. Now, this is a warning that also for the final exam, it is not going to be just multiple choice. There's going to be all sorts of questions in there. There's going to be drag and drop. There's going to be fill in the gaps. There's going to be some W, X, Y, Z multiple choice questions, which don't be fooled. They're quite tricky. There's going to be some picture ones. There's going to be scenario ones. There's going to be some sneak stuff in there, but it's all going to be doable and it's going to be a lot of fun. So before we start answering some questions, so it looks like there's quite a few there. So hopefully we'll get through many as time will allow. So next week, we're going to start the ball off rolling by looking at number 2 of those primitives, which we looked at tonight, symmetric encryption. And we're going to be looking at some of the early ciphers that are considered to be symmetric encryption ciphers. And there's going to be some pretty funky hands-on exercises available for you to do to actually decrypt and encrypt some text and get a feel for what simplified encryption is. While it'd be lovely to be able to just throw you into the deep end and say, try and crack this AES piece of encryption, that's not going to happen. It's not the purpose of the course. We don't want to do that. We don't want to be mean. So we're going to give you some nice, simple things to encrypt and decrypt to get you the juices sort of flowing and the interest in how crypto works from an algorithm and mathematical perspective. So hopefully you'll really enjoy it. So with all that said and done, what have we got for questions?
Oh, we got dozens of them. And in fact, just on your point, about the purpose of this short course, if you're all enjoying it and having a nice time and would like to, at the end of this short course, build on it further with another short course, maybe an extension of this one as Matt's next short course, when we do that, whenever he's available, and if we do a couple of other ones, let everyone know in the course survey. I'd love to try that. We've never done sort of 2 short courses that sort of designed to sort of flow on from one to the next. So I want to try it. And if you'd be keen, let us know and make it happen.
Well, the interesting thing is too, is that what we're looking at in this course is, the basics of encryption, and there's so much more we can build on as well. So that's something else to keep in mind for those people as well.
Yeah, let's see what we can get up to, get away with, make IT Masters agree to. Rightio, so we have 50 questions, Matt, and I am happy to stay far too long, and we'll be led by you and Hannah as to how long we go for. Thanks for sending them in, everyone. We'll just try and whip through them. What do you reckon, Hannah? We'll keep going, and you can just tell me when to stop. But given there's so many, I might say in about 60 to 90 seconds, we'll cut the questions off altogether. I'll let you decide when to do that, and you can let people know in the chat, Hannah, and that'll just give us at least some boundaries. Alrighty, I'll see if there's anything right at the bottom. Oh, yeah, we didn't get a poll, guys, slacking off. Absolutely true. I figured we'd be going long anyway. I'll have some very special polls for you next week. Don't worry, Davo. And they'll be every bit as silly as they usually are.
Indeed.
Is it really a problem if you have a hash clash because the individual message is still confirmed to be correct? Halky asks.
It can in some circumstances, and we'll actually explore that a little bit in week 4. But in general, you're not going to get a hash clash anyway. It'd be very, very unlikely, particularly, as I said, because as you use hashing algorithms that have more bits involved, so longer bit length, the likelihood of that happening are few and far between. And certainly in a environment where you're actually communicating live, it's not going to be an issue. You're not going to run into that at all. The main area where you may run into that is where you've got files stored and you've got hash values stored as well, or potentially in a password store where you might have hash values that clash for obvious reasons. So that may be an issue, but it's unlikely to occur. So in some circumstances, particularly when you're talking about stored information or stored entities, then it can be an issue. But in typical transmission over a wire, no, it's not something that you're going to have to worry about.
Thank you. Sorry to change gears on your, Matt. But before we go to the rest of the questions, there's something I want to talk about, and it's the ADF CyberGap program. Last night, Hannah, Chantel, the CEO of IT Masters, me, and Fulia, who is like the expert on the ADF program, ran a webinar on a program that is designed to close the gap between where the federal government wants cybersecurity capability in Australia to be and where it is currently, which is somewhere a long way away from that. So there's a really cool program where the government is basically sponsoring education. We're going to set up some links on the course page so you can have a look at that. And I really strongly encourage you to consider it if you're keen on doing some study. It's sort of like a no-brainer. You just apply for it and see what happens. And there's no obligation if you get in. So that's a cool program. Hannah, if possible, could you please chuck a link in the chat? You've got all the links hanging about. There you go. Wonderful. And yeah, it's a really cool deal. Also, I've just been told that perhaps there's an issue with the quiz, which should be available now. If there is, we'll fix it, and then you can try again tomorrow. It's totally cool. The weekly or the module quizzes are just sort of something to make sure you've been paying attention, and then at the end of the course, you'll do an exam. But we'll talk about all that later. We're turning to the long-winded question and answer session, and I think it's very important that we ask Paul's first. Is it true that Matt's password is always cricket?
No comment.
Very good. Mark, it's a great point. We'll upload the Q&A to the forum or to the course page afterwards, so you can see all of the questions as they came in. And on the forums, any questions that we don't get to tonight because we ran out of time or because, well, we cut off questions, chuck them in the forum. They're a great space to, I guess, continue the discussion, as Tony Jones might have said, or join the discussion. Yeah, for people that are beginners, it's a great place to catch up. For people that are sort of, ready to get ripping into things, you can sort of extend yourselves in there as well. Any ideas about which tools to use, or sort of some of those ones like, in your opinion, what is the best X, or a lot of the maybe sort of answer questions are probably best dealt with in the forums, because people can sort of add a lot of context to it and then talk about, the situation, which then might, clarify which is the best when. So with all of that in mind, we're clearing up the questions as we go. Let's go back up to the top and go with Afun. The weakest link in the security chain is the human being. How can we minimize human error and strengthen the safety chain? First of all, would you agree with the claim that the weakest link is the human?
Yes. I don't think there's much doubt about that. Minimizing human error is a huge challenge in cybersecurity, and it's something we talk about quite a lot in ITI 581. And security awareness programs and education are really the best way to try and strengthen that weakness in the human being. A big part of the weakness of the human being in this respect is that we have a almost unique requirement or want or will to help others and to trust others. And that, of course, is our downfall. So it's really about, and so that's why things like phishing emails and social engineering, that's why those sorts of attacks work, because we all want to expect the best of people and trust people, and we want to help people. Well, most of us do anyway. So it's really about awareness, so understanding, making sure that your employees or people, whatever role they're in, understand the risks that are related to their particular role and the sorts of things they need to look out for, and educating them on how to better deal with it. Educating our people to report when they see something suspicious, not just let it go by. Now, if they get a dodgy email or a strange email, actually forward it on and report it, rather than just deleting it and sending it, so that we don't know what's going on. So they're the two main things: awareness, education, and getting people to be proactive in keeping their own part of the pie, if you like, secure.
Thank you. A few we can maybe whip through. H. Barty, do we need to download keyloggers, or do we need to observe digital certificates in this course?
Nope. On neither of those. We will talk about digital certificates, but there's nothing too in-depth in either one of those, and nothing to do with keyloggers.
Thank you. What is the programming skill level required to complete this course? 0.
You don't have to know how to program in any language at all. We provide you with the tools for the hands-on activities. You don't require any programming skill whatsoever. Thank goodness for Kieran and me.
Sadakul, will we be learning about cipher or block ciphers and stream ciphers in this course?
To a degree, yes. So we talk about those in week 3 when we get to asymmetric encryption. Asymmetric encryption, we do talk a little bit about block and stream ciphers, the differences, and how they're implemented.
Thank you, Sadakul and Matt. And Fletcher's asking, and I think someone else did later on, are we going to find out how elliptical curve or Diffie-Hellman works? First of all, what on earth are you talking about, Fletcher?
Yeah.
And
well, I know what he's talking about. So,
that's good.
We won't be talking so much elliptical curve, but we will be talking about Diffie-Hellman. Yes, again, that's in week 3.
What's Diffie-Hellman?
Well, you'll have to tune in on week 3.
You're so good at this suspense and signposting. Alrighty, so that's a few quick ones. Archnigum. So if software and hardware installation do not follow policy, then how should we have to deal with this in an organization?
Okay, so what you really need to do is implement a policy that is going to be used. And if there's, first of all, to be able to do that, you need to be able to management support for that. Obviously, if you don't, then it's not going to go anywhere. So my advice is to actually have a policy, to develop a policy that can be enforced and that is supported by upper level management. If that's not going to happen, then it's very difficult it's really, really difficult to be able to manage that, because if there's no policy, no management support, no no consequences if things aren't followed, and I don't mean sacking people or whatever, but if there's nothing that you can say, all right, if you do this, then this will happen, then you're not going to get anywhere. So there has to be that effort made to come up with some sort of policy that fits within the scheme of your organisation and needs to be signed off by management.
Patrick asks, would a hacker be able to force an emergency reset of the firewall settings?
Potentially, yes. There's a potential for that. I haven't seen it happen in the real world. I've seen it happen in a lab environment. So yes, it is. I won't go into too much detail on that, but it is possible to do that. But it comes down to ensuring that you have a firewall system that can understand and recognize attacks on itself. But the key is there needs to be an attacker would need to gain access to the file at a fairly high level in order to be able to do that. So so when we start talking about password policies and accounts and the ability to access a firewall from external or internal, these are all factors that we need to think about. It's probably more likely for that to happen from an internal connection rather than external in typical firewall deployments if they're done correctly, but yes, it is possible.
Thank you. Hello, Matt. What kind of combination of solutions or tools are good for defense in depth in banking systems? This might be a good one for the forums.
Wow, I think that's an excellent one for the forums. That is my answer to all design questions that are posed to me is, the first thing I say is, well, it depends. It depends on your context, and it depends on what you're trying to protect. It depends on what your budget is, depends on what your internal skills are. There's lots of different answers to come up with that. I'm not willing to sit here and say that there is any one combination of solutions or tools that are ideal for DID in banking systems. There's so many different answers to that question. I think it's probably better to take that one offline, where we can engage in a more in-depth discussion. I think that's not something I could answer now.
Yeah, and with 5,000 people in the short course, there's probably people working in the banks, as it sounds like you are as well, who have got a fair bit of experience in doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ahmed asks, what is the relation between blockchain and cryptography?
Well, that is something that we'll also answer in week 3. So tune in. That answer is coming.
Excellent. That'll save some time. Is setting up botnet worth doing if you suspect or discover an attack? Thank you, Kinan.
Maybe. Again, it's a depend sort of answer without any sort of context around that. It's quite difficult to answer that question. But it's not something you would typically look at. But depending on what you're trying to achieve by doing it, it might be yes.
Really, thank you. I love talking about this stuff, despite the fact I have no idea. Well, I love other people talking about it, I should say. Vikram is asking, in future, if we have supercomputers or quantum computers, particularly, then how would cryptography be kept strong?
Oh, well, I mean, yes, that is true.
Yes.
Well, there's a potential for that, but there's a potential for that to be an issue in the cryptographic world. But we all know that supercomputers and quantum computers are coming, and the theory behind them are, well, not coming. In some aspects, they actually already exist. But the theories behind them are relatively well known in research circles, in particular. And cryptography it's like anything. Anything in security, it will keep pace with the development of faster and faster systems. So unless you know someone that's got a dirty great big quantum system sitting around, I think we're protected for the short term. But the answer to that is cryptography technologies will advance at a similar pace, and indeed will be able to advance at a similar pace because of the advent of supercomputing and quantum computing.
And if you do know someone who has a quantum computer lying around, get them to get in touch with me, because we'll try and run a short course.
That'd be cool.
Would. Greg, my employer has suggested employees should start using passphrases instead of passwords. It gives example passphrases that are all words run together.
Yep. Yep.
No, wouldn't such passphrases be susceptible to dictionary attacks?
Not as much as single words, by all means, but there is a possibility that they could be. But if you implement it in such a way that you have a minimum length of character, then it's, their research has shown that they're as effective as having random characters, and they're obviously a lot easier to remember. The other way you can think about it too is you might have a passphrase, so something like the red fox walks across the lake, for example, but you don't have to write it in plain alphabet characters. You can say, for example, replace the O's with zeros, the E's with threes, the S's with dollar signs, and that effectively turns it into a multi-character password in any case. The advantage of passphrases is that they are much easier for people to remember, particularly if you're talking about 10 characters or more in randomly generated passwords. The vast majority of people won't be able to remember them, or if they do, they'll remember one and use it on all their logins, on all across all systems, which is actually a bigger security problem than having just a passphrase and different passphrase for each account. So in answer to your question, if you're just using regular dictionary words, then absolutely they're susceptible to dictionary attacks, but it depends on how you put them together.
Thank you, Greg. An anonymous attendee is wondering, do commercial widely used root C8, is that certification?
Certificate authorities.
Yep, private keys get handed over willingly or not to government security agencies to allow them to sniff out man-in-the-middle attacks?
I don't know, to be honest. Do they get handed over willingly to the government security agencies? Who knows what government security agencies have access to? The standard answer would be no, of course not. That's an invasion of privacy. But I'm not going to be so naive to say that that doesn't happen. So, but I have no knowledge of that happening.
Check your favorite wacky forums.
Exactly.
SJ, password managers, yay or nay?
I know people that use them, absolutely, and have no problem with them, have no problem with security, and they work fine. So long as, the way that you access that password manager is secure, so the password you're using, for example, is secure, then there's no, they're no better or worse than any other encrypted system. And they're certainly better than writing passwords in a notepad or on a sticky note. So I think that they certainly have their place. Personally, I don't use them, but then I remember all my passwords. But I've always had a knack for doing that. Passwords and IP addresses are two things that I have no problem remembering. If only I was good at remembering things I learned in year 11 and year 12, but unfortunately, that's not the case.
Truly terrifying.
and generally completely useless.
Oh, go on. That's amazing. So is it a different password for all of them, apart from cricket 1, cricket 2, cricket 3, and you remember which one?
No, I don't have simple passwords like that. Mine are definitely many characters and random characters. But no, I've just always had a knack for remembering passwords. I couldn't tell you why. And as I said, IP addresses, because most people work in DNS. And like when you're surfing a website, you type in www.whatever.com. Most people work in DNS because it's easier for us to remember. It's English language. I actually prefer to work in IP addresses all the time. Just remember them. Just
the more you know. Gosh,
yeah,
I love these short courses just for this. Thank you, SJ. Would CRC/SHA verification come under cryptography and also for the uninitiated? What does that mean?
Well, CRC is in most cases, I think is what Patrick's talking about, is cyclic redundancy checking. SHA is SHA, which we actually talk about in week 4. So it actually is a hashing algorithm. So it does come under cryptography, yes.
Thank you.
So CRC, if he's talking about cyclic redundancy check, not so much. It's a different thing again. That's to basically prove Well, it is an integrity verification method, but it's more to do with transmitting packets in clear text. So a typical thing that you'd use in protocols.
Thank you. Joe asks, what would be a simple example to verify data and a simple example to validate data?
I'm not sure I understand the question, to be honest. So verification is about proving, I think I know what you're talking about. So verification is about proving that what was sent is what arrived. Okay, it's verifying that document A that was sent arrives as document A, and it's exactly the same. Validation is more about confirming that the content is accurate. So, for example, when I talked about the financial transactions earlier, validation of that is ensuring that the actual value that was the value of the transaction is correct. So that's making sure that the value of the transaction is valid, whereas verifying it is just ensuring that what was sent is what is received. So it may be that at the sender end, they've actually typed in the wrong digits, for example, for the value. And so we can verify that the same value was received at the end, but that doesn't make it valid. So we then have to validate that value to make sure that it's the value that should have been sent.
And would that be the second primitive that would be relevant to?
Well,
sort of all of them?
It's relevant to all of them, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. Brett asks,
I wondered if this question was coming.
how do you see the future use of passwordless logins in the future in security in cryptography?
Well, I think it's going to happen, whether we like it or not. I mean, we saw an article announcement the other day about Microsoft and all the Microsoft stable of cloud-based services going passwordless in the very near future. So it's going to happen, and in some ways, it's not necessarily to change the way in which cryptography is used per se at this stage with the current algorithms. It may be that will change in the future, and there will be passwordless algorithms, which this sort of is in a way. And again, we'll sort of talk about that in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, that's definitely going to happen, and it's I think it's here to stay. And it's not a bad way to go, really, because then it removes two things. One, it removes the requirement for people to actually remember passwords anyway, which is always going to be a bugbear. And the other one is it prevents the things like brute force attacks and dictionary attacks will become a thing of the past because there is no password to break. That's a really interesting question, though.
Andrew Luck, is it always safe to use open source application?
No. It's not always safe. The advantage with open source, of course, is that you have lots of people looking at it and developing it. And if a bug or a problem is detected, it's quite often more quickly fixed than it is in a commercial package. But no, there's no doubt that no application is 100% trustworthy all the time.
Tony wonders why, after all these years using email, how come emails are not encrypted intrinsically? Is it because it will add more load time to emails or just slowness?
Oh, well, it certainly adds a fraction of latency in terms of passing up the email from a digital transmission perspective and sending it off. But really, that's probably irrelevant with email anyway, because email is a hop-by-hop protocol. So SMTP, which is the protocol that delivers between mail servers, is a hop-by-hop protocol anyway, and it can be significantly slowed anywhere from sending server to destination server, because generally they'll pass through a number of different servers before they get there. So I don't think that's the issue. It's probably more to do, in my experience, just with people not knowing A, that it even the possibility exists to use it, or B, they don't know how to configure it.
Stephen Gall asks, is it true that the algorithms are based on prime numbers, and why is this so? Is it the case that the larger the prime number, the better the encryption? Encryption
algorithms are often based on prime numbers. It's not to say they exclusively use prime numbers, but And absolutely, the larger, well, the larger the number, larger the random number, the larger the key, the larger the bit size of the algorithm, absolutely, the better the encryption, the stronger it will be. Absolutely, assuming, again, as I said before, that you keep the key secret. If you don't, then it doesn't matter how big your prime number is or how good your encryption algorithm is, it's compromised straight away.
So I think that answers the next question. Can the secret key be compromised when it's being shared with the recipient in single key encrypting?
Absolutely, absolutely. But there are mechanisms built into symmetric or asymmetric, symmetric when you combine the two together. There are functions built in an encryption system that help to protect that, and we will look at that in the next couple of topics. But absolutely, it can be compromised. Yes.
Do the keys have a thumbprint like digital certificates do?
Generally, no. Not generally, but there's a sort of a thumbprint. It's not really a thumbprint, but you could, again, we'll discuss this when we get to asymmetric and PKI. But in a private public key setting, there is almost like a thumbprint on it, but in symmetric encryption, not so much.
And we've got just a few questions there, folks. We're getting into the hashes this one. If there's a finite number of bits, when an infinite number of values map to the same value?
Yeah, well, that is true. The smaller the number of bits you'll have, the likely that there will be multiple values that will hash to that same value. So as I was saying before, if you have a 4-bit hashing algorithm, you are much more likely to come across, or keep it really simple, if you had a 1-bit algorithm, right, 1-bit hashing algorithm, and it delivers a hash to you in hexadecimal, sorry, 1 character, so that's actually 8 bits, sorry. So if you had an 8-bit algorithm, that would generate 1 hexadecimal character. No, I'm getting my maths wrong. 4-bit. So I'll get it right in a minute. No, so if you had a 4-bit algorithm, hexadecimal characters are represented by 4 bits because they can be any value from 0 to 15. So if you had a 4-bit algorithm, it could only generate 16 different values. So potentially every 16th, 17th, 18th value you came up with, regardless of what the text was, would be a clash. Absolutely. But if you go to a 56-bit algorithm or more, the more bits you have, the more likely it is that you won't get a clash. That's not to say you won't, because absolutely, if you have 56 bits, there are still bucket loads of different combinations of text that could result in the same hash value. But the value is that the likelihood of it happening close together is so remote that it's not going to affect transmission of information in any case. And that's what I was saying before. It's more likely to be an issue if you've got stored information. If you're just talking about hashing each data transmission or each piece of information as you transmit it, and then once it's transmitted, it doesn't matter anymore, then it's not an issue. So yes, your statement is correct, but it's not an issue because of the number of bit sizes that we use in hashing algorithms.
Well, I might just knock out Sadikool's 2 questions. What are some tools you can use to create hash values other than MD5? There'll be heaps and heaps and heaps available, and that's a really good forum question as to who uses which one, when, and why.
Yeah, there's lots of different tools.
Yeah, and just broadly, as we were just talking about, the more bits, the better to avoid risk of collision.
Yeah, absolutely.
Richard asks, are there any advantages of a hash versus a CRC when checking integrity of a download, or is a CRC simply considered a type of hashing?
No, they're really just different algorithms. So a CRC, a cyclic redundancy check, is a information assurance tool that's typically used in data communication protocols, whereas hashing is a mathematical algorithm that spits out a value. So they're different. They're different. So CRC is not really considered to be a hashing algorithm. It's considered more to be just a check of integrity in packet transmissions, or in this case, as you're saying, with a file. So they provide a similar output, but in a very different way. So in terms of advantages, it depends on what you're doing, but if you're just checking the integrity of a download, it's really going to be much different.
There's a few questions to finish up on hashes about how they work. If the hash is smaller than the message, does that mean there must exist other messages that create the same hash, as there can be infinite messages, but limited number of hashes?
Yeah, and that's basically the similar answer to what I gave before. Absolutely, that there is a possibility of hash clashes, but again, if we use a hash algorithm with a sufficient bit length, then the likelihood of that occurring within the time frame that it matters is remote.
Another one from Aaron: is the hash algorithm secret? Can't you just reverse all the steps to make a message with the same hash if you know the algorithm?
No, the hashing algorithm is not secret. And no, because of the way the mathematics work, you can't reverse all the steps to create the message. And we'll see that when we get I'll explain that in more detail when we get to week 4.
Yeah, stay tuned. And lastly, TJ, what if I wrote a string of text, I wrote a string in a text file, saved it, hashed it, then went back and added a space, saved it, removed the same space and saved it again to update the save time file? Would the hash return to its original hash? And again, we've sort of answered that one already. But
well, that one's actually slightly more tricky. So if you were to, you write a string, save it, hash it, you'll come out with one hash value. Then you go back in, add the space, saved it. If you were to create another hash then clearly you would have a different hash value. If you go back into it before you update the hash, remove the same space and save it again to update the save file time, that's not in most hashing algorithms, that is not going to change the original hash because the actual content of the file itself hasn't changed. However, in hashing algorithms that take the creation date and the creation time and creation date and update date, modification date, that's what I was trying to get out, modification date into account, then yes, it will change. That will definitely change the hash. And that can be important because sometimes it's important to know whether something has been changed rather than what the changes are. Because in that case, you wouldn't see a change, but the file has been manipulated in some way, and there are some cases that may be important to you. You may want to know whether a file has been, tampered with, even if it does look the same. And that sort of ties in a little bit with forensic our subject IT 513 subject forensic investigations,
which we did a short course on very recently.
We did do a short course on that not that long ago, and that sort of discussion ties in perfectly with that scenario.
Yeah, I'll send you some links to some good short courses. And good job, Matt, answering all of those very many questions. Heavens to Betsy, 109 questions answered. Well done.
That's not bad, is it? That's not bad at all. Well done. And
so
great engagement. Great engagement.
Oh, yeah.
You know me, Guy. That's never an issue.
No, it's very much appreciated every time. Thank you for the well over 400 who stuck around for the whole time as we work through those questions, and thanks for those that came earlier, and thanks for those that are listening along later. Thank you so much, Hannah, for moderating the chat. Very difficult task with some 950 plus attendees most of the time. Well done.
Yeah, hats off as normal, Hannah. Great job.
And, oh, by the way, Hannah has already fixed the quiz, so thanks heaps for that, legend. Good job. So you can go straight onto that one now if you can. If you've still got a bit of energy left, I'm done for. And all I have to say left now is thank you so much, Matt. I'll leave you to sign off. Always a pleasure, and see you next week.
No worries at all. Thank you very much, Guy, for your excellent job as being MC as ever. And again, just want to reiterate thanks to Hannah for her outstanding work across all the short courses that she's been involved with, but tonight again as well. And thank you to you, obviously, everyone, for turning up and tuning in and listening to it. So importantly, next week, as I said, we'll be looking at symmetrical encryption. So we'll start to break down these, particularly the last 3 of the primitives that we spoke about tonight. So symmetric encryption, asymmetric encryption in week 3, and then hashing in week 4. And a lot of the questions which was we sort of palmed off, if you like, to the next couple of weeks, we'll the answers to those will start to expose themselves. So please tune in next week, because I think it's going to be a really good, fun course. There's lots of really good hands-on activities for you to have a go at as of next week, and I think everyone will get a lot out of it. So thank you for your attendance, and I hope to see you all next week.